Hello, I am back with another video on what to be sowing this month. If you haven't seen that before, every single month I release a video on what you could be sowing, so that way you don't have to remember what to be sowing. I'm gonna do it for you. And so as usual, I'm gonna be starting with flowers, then moving on to vegetables, and then finally herbs. Of course, timestamps are below, so whatever you grow, you can find it on here. But come April, I am gonna be splitting this video into flowers separately from vegetables because April in zone 5 and warmer is really go time for us, which means that there's tons of things that you're gonna be able to plant. But right now we're at that starting line, just waiting for that sound to go off telling us to start the race. And so for us here in March, I've got just over a dozen seeds that you can be starting. And so I'm going to take you through all of those in this video. If you're new here, my name is Bree from Urban Gardening Canada and I garden in Ottawa Zone 5. So I am going to start with the flower seeds because that's just where we start in these videos. And so the first one that you could be starting is sweet peas. If you live on the West Coast, you've probably already started your sweet peas because these are a cool season crop. But if you're anywhere else in Canada, you've probably not started your sweet peas yet, so now is a really good time to do it. You can put them out before your final frost. And they do benefit from pinching in order to branch. And so these are a favorite for anybody who likes to get that nice jelly bean scent that they give. And they're also really good in cut flowers. So this is definitely one that you want to be starting in March. So the next one is snapdragons, and this is also a cool season crop. And so these are really fun to grow both in the spring and the fall. I've had my snapdragons blooming all the way into October. So if you absolutely love them, and if this is your first year growing them, then I recommend starting them this spring and then growing a second round of them for the fall. But again, they're a cool season crop, which means you can technically get them out before your last frost date. So starting them now is exactly what you want to do, and that's why you're starting them earlier than the majority of your annual flowers. And so the next three are ones that I told you in January to put in your fridge for cold stratification. And so it's finally time to pull them out and start growing them. The first one is echinacea. You can now pull those out of your fridge and start planting them. And these can be really slow to germinate. And so you do want to have patience when it comes to growing these ones. But once they're up, they are good to go and they'll grow nice and strong and bloom for you this season. The second one is rudbeckia or black-eyed Susans. These are also a really small seed with a really tiny seedling. And so you do need to have some patience and a steady hand when you're growing these ones and upgrading them. But you can pull these ones out of the fridge now too and plant these. Both echinacea and rudbeckia are perennials, so when you do decide to plant them outside, make sure wherever you put them, you plan properly that they're gonna stay there for a long time unless you wanna dig them out and move them. Because of course, nobody's garden stays the same year after year, but do keep in mind that they are perennials and they will reseed over the season. So you do want to plan that they can spread a little bit. But of course, they're both big fan favorites for pollinators. And so I absolutely recommend including them in your garden. And the final flower seed for March is columbine. And so this was in your fridge for about 30 days. And so you can pull them out. If you didn't put them in the fridge, not a big deal, they'll still grow. And so you can get wild columbine or an ornamental one. And again, this is also a perennial. Okay, so that's everything for the flowers. So quickly before we get into the vegetables, I wanted to mention, if you haven't planned it already, I have a free square foot garden planner. I'll put a little preview of it in the video here. And so if you like to plan your garden using Excel, or if you use the square foot gardening method, this planner is really amazing because it has a drop-down menu where you can choose whatever plant you're planning to grow, and it's going to fill in how many of them can fit into that square foot. And on the right side, it's going to accumulate a list of all of the plants you chose and how many plants can fit in your garden. And this is specifically for a 4x8 garden, but of course you can just duplicate it if you have more gardens than that. And so this list on the right is going to either build you a list of how many seeds you need to plant, or how many seedlings you need to buy. And so this tool is really good as we get into March for planning. And so if you wanted to grab that, I am going to put it in the description below so you can grab it there. So let's get into the vegetables now. So if you missed my February video and you haven't started them yet, you definitely want to start your peppers. So these in Canada do best when they start in February. It might seem wild to start them this early and you're like, my plants are going to be huge inside by the time it's plant out date. Even if you're in a zone 3 or a zone 4, you still want to get them started. Because they take such a long time from flower to fruit maturity, the earlier you start them inside, the better chance that you get for a good harvest. Even when I lived in a zone 6, I really struggled with getting good pepper harvest, and that's because I was starting my seeds in the beginning of April or mid to late March. And the minute I started sowing my seeds in February, I started getting bounties and bounties of peppers, especially hot peppers. They like that longer growing time in February, but the bell peppers like it too. So if you haven't got them in the ground yet, this is the first one on your list to get in the soil, get them on a heat mat, and they should germinate within a week. So the second one is eggplants. Eggplants are also slow growers, and again too, if you want a really good harvest, you do want to start these around mid-March is a good time, so you don't need to get them in the ground right away. And so this is a really great time to make sure that you also get a really good harvest for the length of time that it takes them to mature. Of course, not all varieties take the same length of time. So if you do have a shorter days to maturity variety, you can start it a little bit later in March, but the sooner you start these ones, the better size your plant is to get yourself a really good harvest. Next up is one that is literally my favorite garden plant. And if you're not growing it, go buy seeds now, and that is ground cherries, or their husk Cape gooseberries, I think they can be called too. They are in the same family as the nightshades and are related to tomatoes or tomatillos, where they have the husk on them, but these taste more like fruit than they do a tomato. And I would know because I do not like tomatoes, and so if I love ground cherries, then they don't really taste like tomatoes to me. And the more ripe they are, the more fruity they get. They're kind of like a tropical pineapple flavor, but these grow really slowly as well. If you've grown them in the past, then they readily self-seed in the garden. So if you're out of seeds or they don't do a great job in germinating, you can assume that you're going to get some in your garden this coming season. So don't fret too much about it. But these also grow really slowly, and the seedlings are so small, so it's really difficult to transplant them. So you want to start them early enough that you can get them large enough that it's easy to pot them and also plant them in the garden. And so I recommend starting these ones in a larger pot that you can sow multiple seeds in. Wait for them to get about an inch tall, and then you can transplant them into larger pots. But again, these are so small that you definitely want to start them earlier to give them the best chance. And then next up is tomatoes. I highly recommend not starting tomatoes until the end of March, especially if you've ever noticed cherry tomatoes grow significantly faster than beefsteak varieties. So depending on the variety you're growing, you can choose when you're going to plant them, but I wait until the end of March to grow mine. So if you're growing a lot of beefsteak varieties, you can grow them maybe the last week of March, but generally I wait quite literally until March 30th or March 31st to be planting my tomatoes. They grow really fast, and you don't want to end up with a 2-foot tall plant in your house because that's a lot of space and a lot of soil. And so getting the timing right is really important. So wait until the end of March for that one if you're in zone 5 or colder. So this one you don't technically have to start inside, but if you want to grow broad beans, you can choose to grow them inside. And these are a really cold hardy plant. And so again, I would wait until the end of March to be growing these ones, unless you're having a really warm winter and it looks like you'll be able to plant out by mid-April. Then you can start your broad beans inside mid-March till the 3rd week of March. But if you're like us and you've got 10 feet of snow, okay, we don't have 10 feet, like 4 feet of snow on the ground, then you might want to wait a little while. I do find though that my broad beans do best when they're sown directly outside, but you can start them inside. And so I would start them about 2 weeks before your plant out date. So if you are looking to plant in mid-April, then you can definitely start your broad beans inside in March. And then the other 3 that I'm going to list here are also cold season crops, and so it sounds weird to start these in March, but that would be kale, Swiss chard, and lettuce. And so I think that you should be starting these in the beginning to middle of March, because you should be able to get these out by mid-April, if not between mid-April to the end of April. And so giving them that 4 weeks of growth is typically what the package says, but it will say start these 4 weeks before your last frost date. But you do want to start them earlier because they can handle a light frost. They can handle temperatures below 0 degrees Celsius. And so if you start these in mid-March, you are giving yourself 4 weeks for these to grow, so you can plant them outside anywhere between middle of April to the end of April, which means that you will have capitalized on that cold temperature of the spring that Swiss chard, kale, and lettuce love, and you're going to be able to harvest your food way before anybody else is. And I always find that I'm laughing as people are still hardening off their plants while I'm having entire lettuce bowls or salad bowls of greens, because I started my plants in March and I was able to harvest them early. All right, so I'm moving on to the final 3. And this video is faster than normal because I'm just really excited, so I'm talking really fast. And so these are the herbs. And so these are the woody herbs that I didn't mention in February that I think should be started in March, and that is thyme, oregano, and sage. So these get started earlier than your annual herbs because woody herbs take longer to grow. However, I find that herbs like rosemary take a really long time to grow from seed versus sage, oregano, and thyme grow quite fast, and you don't really want them to be too huge before you plant them outside because, again, you don't want to waste the space and the soil. And so I find these ones to grow decently quick compared to rosemary, and so this is why I'm saying start them in March. I also think that these are a good one to be starting at the beginning of March, so you do get that little bit of extra time for them to grow. Oregano seeds are also so small, they're like little pieces of dust, as is the thyme, and so you do want to sow these on the surface. And similar to snapdragons or ground cherries, I would put them into one larger container where you can sow multiple on top, allow them to grow to a certain size before you separate them out, versus planting one per pot, because it's actually a total waste of space if you have a cell pack, and it's just better to bulk sow them on top of the soil and then pull them out as they get larger. And then the sage has a bit of a larger seed, so you can plant these in their own separate pots and allow them to grow to a certain size before uppotting them. And just remember that all 3 of these are perennials, and if you protect them over the winter, they can last through the winter, at least in zone 5 and warmer. And so you don't want to plant too much of it because it's going to stay in your garden year after year and it will self-sow. And oregano is known to creep, as is thyme, and it can take over your garden. And so just be mindful of how many seeds you're sowing, because otherwise you can sell the seedlings. If you've caught my video on how to sell seedlings to make a little bit of extra cash to fund your hobby, then you can absolutely do that and grow a little bit extra. But otherwise, you really only need 4 or 5 plants unless you absolutely adore any of these specific herbs. And that is everything for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell notification, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.